I was in the bathroom when the announcement came over the loudspeaker. "This is a lockdown. Repeat, this is a lockdown. Everyone, stay where you are and lock your doors." I froze, standing alone in the empty restroom. The voice on the intercom was shaky, and it sounded serious. I could barely process what was happening. But then I saw something that made it all too real. I glanced out the small window next to the bathroom stalls, the one that overlooked the schoolyard. That's when I spotted him. A man, about 100 yards away, standing in the middle of the yard. He was holding a gun. For a brief second, our eyes locked. That was all I needed. Without thinking, I bolted out of the restroom, not caring where I was going, only that I needed to run. Fast. I sprinted toward the fence at the far end of the yard, my heart hammering in my chest. He was still too far away for me to hear his footsteps, but I knew he was coming. I scrambled over the first fence, stumbling as I hit the ground on the other side. I glanced back. He was still walking toward me, closing the distance slowly, like he knew there was no rush. I didn't stop to think about it. Ahead of me was another fence, taller than the first. There was no way I could climb over it. My only option was the old side door leading to the administrative building. Students weren't allowed in there, but right now, that didn't matter. I pulled open the door and slipped inside, my hands trembling as I tried to lock it behind me. It wouldn't lock. No matter how hard I twisted the knob, it stayed loose. Panicking, I gave up and ran further inside. The hallway was dim, with just enough light from emergency signs to see where I was going. I had no plan, no idea what to do, but I couldn't stop moving. At the end of the hall, I reached a staircase. I hesitated for a split second. Up or down? I went up. I sprinted up the stairs, taking 2 at a time, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached the top floor and found myself in another long hallway, filled with more boxes and piles of old papers scattered across the floor. I tripped. My foot caught on one of the boxes, sending papers flying everywhere. I hit the floor hard. My palms stung from the impact, but that wasn't what scared me. It was the noise, the sound of boxes crashing and papers fluttering to the ground. He had to have heard that. I scrambled to my feet, glancing back over my shoulder. I could hear faint footsteps from below now. He was inside the building. I ran, testing every door along the hallway. Each one was locked. My panic rose with every locked handle. Finally, I found an open door at the end of the hall. I slipped inside and quickly shut the door behind me. The room was a mess, filled with old, broken-down office supplies, filing cabinets, and piles of junk. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a small, grimy window high on the wall. I pushed an old cabinet in front of the door, hoping it would be enough to hold him back. Then I heard them. Police sirens. They were close. Maybe even inside the school now, but it didn't matter. He was closer. The door rattled behind me. My breath caught in my throat. He was trying to get in. I could hear him grunting, shoving against the cabinet. The door creaked under the pressure. He wasn't going to stop. I needed to hide. Fast. My eyes darted around the room. There was a bench in the corner, low to the ground and covered in junk. It wasn't much, but it was my only option. I crawled under it, pulling my knees up to my chest and pressing myself as far back as I could. The curtain over the small window was barely drawn, but I hoped it would be enough to keep the light low. Then I heard it. A gunshot. The door shook violently as he fired at the lock. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. The cabinet scraped across the floor as he shoved it out of the way. He was in. I could hear him now, his heavy boots thudding against the floor as he stepped inside the room. He didn't speak at first, just moved around, kicking through piles of papers and junk. Every sound felt deafening in the quiet room. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Then he spoke, his voice low and unnerving. "I know you're in here. You can't hide forever." I swallowed hard, pressing myself tighter against the wall. He was so close now. I could see his boots as he walked through the room, searching. He yanked open cabinets, throwing things around, his frustration growing with every second. He was getting closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to disappear. His footsteps were right next to the bench now. I could feel his presence. Could almost hear him breathing. If he bent down even a little, he'd see me. Then I heard it. A loud bang from outside the room. The sound of running footsteps, voices shouting commands. The police had made it to the second floor. For a split second, the guy froze. He turned toward the door, but it was too late. He'd already wasted too much time. He backed up, bumping into an old printer that toppled to the ground with a crash. The noise was loud, and I knew the police had heard it too. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder, closer. The door burst open, and the next thing I knew, the room was filled with police officers. Their guns were drawn, aimed right at him. "Drop the weapon!" one of them shouted. For a moment he hesitated, his hand gripping the gun tighter. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the moment. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. It clattered to the floor, and he raised his hands in surrender. The police swarmed in, pulling him to the ground and cuffing him. I stayed under the bench, too afraid to move, until one of the officers finally spotted me. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle. "You're safe now." I crawled out, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. It was over. I was alive. Later I learned that the man was a former student, someone who had been bullied when he was younger. He'd come back to the school for revenge, but thanks to the police no one had been hurt. As they led him away in handcuffs, I couldn't stop thinking about how close it had been. How, just a few more seconds, and it could have ended very differently. It started as a normal Friday, last period, math class, and I was zoning out, staring at the clock, waiting for the weekend to begin. Our teacher, Mrs. Palmer, was going over some algebra problems, but none of us were paying attention. Then, the intercom buzzed. "Attention students and staff, we are going into lockdown. This is not a drill. Please follow lockdown procedures." I immediately felt the atmosphere change in the room. Mrs. Palmer's face went white as she rushed to lock the door and turn off the lights. We scrambled to the back of the room, crouching behind desks, our backs pressed against the wall. No one said anything. We just waited in the dark, listening. Everything was quiet for what felt like forever. I kept checking my phone, but there were no updates. Some kids were texting their parents, while others just stared at the floor. I glanced at my friend Jason, who was sitting next to me. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was just as freaked out as I was. Then the knock came. It was slow and steady, just 3 knocks on the classroom door. I froze, my eyes darting toward the front of the room. Mrs. Palmer looked just as confused as the rest of us. No one was supposed to be knocking during a lockdown. The knocks came again. Louder this time. "Who is it?" Mrs. Palmer whispered, though she didn't get up. No one answered. The knocking stopped. For a moment the room was completely silent. We exchanged nervous glances, unsure if it was really over. Mrs. Palmer still hadn't moved. Her eyes were glued to the door. I could tell she was trying to keep calm, but her hand trembled slightly. A few minutes passed and then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was dragging their feet just outside the classroom. They moved down the hall, fading away but not disappearing completely. Whoever it was, they were still nearby, just not right at our door anymore. We all stayed quiet, not daring to make a sound. I was sure everyone was thinking the same thing. What now? The footsteps eventually faded, but before we could relax, we heard a new sound. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping, but it grew louder. The tapping was coming from above us, almost as if something or someone was moving around in the ceiling. I glanced up, and so did a few others, eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Palmer looked up too, her face pale. No one dared say a word. The tapping continued, slow and methodical, as if it was searching for something or someone. Suddenly a ceiling tile shifted slightly, and we all froze, staring at the spot where it might fall. We sat there, frozen in place, unable to look away. The tile shifted again, just barely, but enough for everyone to notice. It felt like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. Without warning, the tile fell. It crashed to the floor with a thud, sending dust into the air. We all jumped. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Mrs. Palmer put a hand to her mouth, clearly trying to stay calm for our sake, but even she looked terrified. We stared at the hole in the ceiling, the opening just big enough for someone, or something, to crawl through. As we stared at the hole in the ceiling, a shadow flitted across the opening, freezing us in place. My heart raced, each beat echoing in the silence. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. "Stay quiet," Mrs. Palmer whispered, her voice barely audible. She pulled us deeper into the corner, trying to shield us from whatever was lurking above. We all exchanged terrified glances, minds racing with questions. Who was up there? Was it someone trying to help us, or something much worse? The shadow shifted again, and then I saw it. A figure, barely visible, slipping closer to the edge of the opening. It was a human, and I could make out the outline of a hooded sweatshirt and dark pants. The figure paused as if sensing our fear, and then slowly leaned over the edge, peering down into our classroom. "Hey!" I wanted to shout, but the words caught in my throat. The figure's eyes glinted in the dim light, scanning the room. It felt like an eternity before they finally spoke, their voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need to get out." Confusion swept through me. Were they telling the truth? Before I could think further, the figure dropped down, landing softly on the floor. They quickly surveyed the room, their movements cautious yet urgent. "Listen, you need to trust me," they said, glancing nervously at the door. "There's someone else here. We need to go, now." Fear and curiosity collided in my mind as I looked at my classmates, all of us unsure of what to do next. The figure stood there, panting, glancing back toward the door. "I swear, I'm not dangerous," he insisted, running a hand through his messy hair. "I'm just trying to escape." "Escape from what?" Mrs. Palmer asked, her voice steadier now, willing to listen. "That person who knocked," he replied, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know who he is, but he's been following me since I got to this school. I found a way to hide in the ceilings, but I think he's onto me." I could hardly breathe, absorbing his words. "How do you know he's following you?" I managed to ask. "I saw him in the hall earlier," he explained. "I was in the ceiling when I heard the lockdown announcement. I thought I'd be safe, but then he started banging on doors. When I heard him knock on yours, I knew he might find me next. I wanted to warn you because I thought he might come after anyone nearby." "What do we do?" Jason whispered, his voice shaky. The figure leaned in, urgency radiating from him. "We need to stay quiet until the police come. He's been lurking around, and if he finds me hiding here, he might do something drastic. I didn't want to put you in danger, but I couldn't just stay silent." Just then, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the door, making us all jump. The figure's face paled. "He's getting closer," he said. "You have to be quiet." The sounds of footsteps approached again, heavy and deliberate. My heart raced as I exchanged anxious glances with my classmates. We could only hope that help would arrive before the danger found us. We all held our breath as the footsteps grew louder. The figure in the ceiling looked back at us, panic etched across his face. "You need to stay quiet," he whispered urgently. Just then, we heard another voice outside the classroom, low and firm. "It is the police. This is a lockdown situation. Open the door." The knocking stopped abruptly. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe they'd catch whoever was outside. The police were here. "Stay hidden," the figure above us warned. "I don't want you caught up in this." We could hear the police moving cautiously down the hall, their footsteps echoing as they approached the door. "Stay with me," I whispered to Jason, who nodded, his eyes wide. The officer knocked gently on our classroom door, and Mrs. Palmer, shaking but determined, went to unlock it. "We're in here," she called. When the door swung open, 2 officers rushed in, their presence instantly calming. "Is everyone all right?" one of them asked, scanning the room. "Not really," I said, pointing at the figure standing near us. "He's right here!" The officers quickly looked at him. "You, stay where you are," one commanded, voice steady. The figure hesitated but raised his hands in surrender. Just then, the second officer stepped back, keeping an eye on the hallway. We heard a scuffle just outside. "We've got him," he shouted, as the first officer moved to secure the area. Moments later, the knocker was dragged into the classroom, his hands cuffed behind his back. He looked dishevelled, eyes darting around the room. "Who are you?" one of the officers demanded, turning to the new arrival. "I'm just a student," the figure said, voice trembling. "I was hiding from him." He pointed at the knocker. The officer turned his attention to the man they had just apprehended. "Why were you following him?" the knocker sneered. "He's the reason I got kicked out. I just wanted to talk." The officer's expression hardened. "You don't follow someone like that. You're in enough trouble as it is." The officer radioed for backup, making sure the area was secure. He looked at us, relief washing over his face. "You're safe now. We're going to ensure this school is secure." As the officers dealt with the situation, I let out a breath I didn't realise I was holding. Today had been terrifying, but we had faced something frightening together, and in that moment, we were stronger for it. I didn't think much about it when Mrs. Thompson asked me to grab the papers. It wasn't the first time I'd been sent to the old storage building behind the main school. A lot of teachers used it to store old files and lesson plans. She gave me the keys and told me where to find the box she needed. "Room 104 on the third shelf," she said, then added, "Don't take too long. Class starts in 10 minutes. I nodded, grabbed my backpack and headed out. The walk wasn't far, just across the main courtyard. The building itself was old, rusty, and had a reputation among the younger kids. They'd always say it was haunted, but everyone knew it was just stories to mess with each other. Still, it looked creepy. The walls were peeling and there were cracks in the windows, but whatever. I wasn't about to get freaked out by an old building. When I got there, I passed Mrs. Beasley, the school secretary. She was sitting at her desk sipping coffee like usual. "Hey, Mrs. Beasley, Mrs. Thompson sent me to grab some papers from room 104. She barely looked up from her computer. "All right, dear, head on in, you know where it is." I nodded and made my way down the hallway. The door to the storage room was heavy and creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. It smelled old, like no one had bothered cleaning the place for years. I flicked on the light, but the room stayed dim. The bulbs were probably older than the building. Shelves lined the walls, packed with boxes, books, and random school supplies that no one had touched in ages. I started looking around for Mrs. Thompson's box, pushing aside old folders and dusty binders. The room was colder than I expected. I rubbed my arms and kept searching. That's when I heard it, a loud click. I froze, looking toward the door. The handle was turning and then it stopped. The door was closed. I hadn't even heard anyone behind me. I walked over to the door and pulled on it, but it wouldn't budge. I pushed again, still stuck. My stomach dropped as I jiggled the handle. Nothing. I reached into my pocket for the key and tried it in the lock. It didn't work. I was confused. I'd just opened the door with the same key and now it was stuck. It was like someone had jammed it from the outside. My hand started shaking a little, but I told myself it was fine. Probably just a broken lock. "Hey, Mrs. Beasley," I yelled. "Can you open the door? It's stuck." No answer. I pounded on the door and called out again. The silence was loud, the kind that makes your ears ring. I pulled out my phone, but no one was picking up. Of course, they were in class. The room felt even colder now, like the temperature had dropped in the last few minutes. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, pacing around the room. I needed to find something to force the door open. There had to be a tool or something around here. I started searching the shelves, pushing aside boxes of old textbooks and broken calculators. And then I saw it. A knife. It was just lying there, on one of the shelves. The blade was covered in dried blood. My heart stopped. There was no one else in the room but me. My hands trembled as I stared at the knife. I wasn't sure if I should touch it or leave it there, but either way I didn't want to stay in this room any longer than I had to. I grabbed the nearest box and tried to use it to force the door open, but nothing worked. The door was still locked. I sat down on the cold floor, wondering if I'd have to wait there until someone noticed I was missing. Minutes passed, maybe 15 or 20. Finally, I heard footsteps. "Thank God," I whispered, jumping up. "Derek," a voice called. It was Harry, one of the guys from my class. "You in here?" "I'm locked in. The door won't open." Harry turned the handle, and just like that, the door swung open easily. "Are you kidding me?" he said, giving me a weird look. "What were you doing in here? The teacher's waiting for you. The door wasn't locked, man, and you had the key." I frowned, stepping out into the hallway. "I'm telling you, the door was jammed. I couldn't get it open." Harry shrugged. "Whatever, let's just go." I shook my head, still confused. Then I remembered the knife. "Wait, there's something else," I said. "I found a bloody knife in there." Harry stopped. "A knife? Like a real one?" I nodded. "Yeah, and it's covered in blood. It's creepy, man. I don't know what to think." Harry looked uneasy. "Show me." We went back inside and I pointed at the shelf where the knife was. He stared at it for a second, then picked it up carefully. "Dude, this is messed up," Harry said. "Why is this even here?" "I don't know, but we need to tell someone," I said, glancing at the door like it might lock again. We took the knife and went back to Mrs. Beasley's desk. She looked up from her computer as we walked in, her face instantly changing when she saw what we were holding. "What on earth?" she said, standing up. "Where did you find that?" "In the storage room," I said. "It was just sitting there on a shelf." Her eyes widened. She stepped back, almost like she was scared to even look at it. "I'm going to have to report this," she said quickly. This is serious." "What is it?" Harry asked. "Do you know something?" Mrs. Beasley hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. 20 years ago, there was a murder in that very room. A student killed a teacher. They found the weapon, but it was lost in evidence later. I thought it was gone." My throat went dry. "And this knife," she nodded. "It looks like the one. I'll need to call the police." Harry and I stood there, not sure what to say. The room felt colder than ever, even though we were out of that dusty storage room. We handed her the knife and she wrapped it up in a towel before making the call. A few days later, we heard from the police. The knife we found? It was the same one used in the murder 20 years ago. The blood on it matched the victim. But here's the weird part. The police had already recovered the murder weapon years ago. So how did we find the same knife? No one had any answers. All I knew was that I wasn't going back to that storage room anytime soon. And every time I walked by it in the courtyard, I couldn't help but feel like someone or something was still there, waiting. Thanks for watching. Like this video and subscribe to the channel if you like the stories.